In Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 51, we read these words. As the time approached for him, Jesus, to be taken up into heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went to another village. I'm reading that partially because it's another fire passage. And James and John in this passage fascinate me because this city has done a very minor thing. Jesus wants to pass through, and passing through in that culture meant keep me for the night. You know, show some hospitality. Give me and my friends some food. Let us have a place to stay. Show us some hospitality for the night. And the Samaritans said, no, we don't want to do that because you're going to Jerusalem. And as everybody knows, Jews and Samaritans hate each other. And so John and James say, hey, Jews and Samaritans hate each other. Now's our chance to get them back. Hey, Jesus, can we call fire down from heaven and just destroy them all? Like, that's a minor overreaction, don't you think? Just minor, I think. Well, perhaps it would help you to know that James and John were known as the sons of thunder. Jesus gave them that nickname himself, and that could have meant that Zebedee, their dad, was a thunderous little man. It could have meant maybe they got their nickname from this passage right here, you know, that they say, Jesus, let's call down fire. Let's get some lightning bolts just to strike that town so everybody dies. And Jesus goes, you guys are just sons of thunder. All you want is you want to just destroy people and cast out lightning and everything. I'm just going to call you thunder children from now on. I don't know. Maybe that's how they got their name. But here's the thing. We're in a series where we're talking about the biblical metaphor of fire. And quite often, the biblical metaphor of fire is used, in fact, most of the time, it's used as a metaphor for God's presence. God's presence sometimes is a presence to give us encouragement and strength. And sometimes his presence is a presence of bringing judgment. And here James and John are saying, okay, Jesus, you give us the encouragement and strength to bring judgment down on these other people. And so, I'm going to share with you today the extra piece, one extra piece of this fire metaphor. We've talked about it a little bit, but it's this idea that God's presence is always mediated to us from other human beings. God's presence is always mediated to us through other human beings. Your mom and dad brought you up in a way that you understood about God first from them, either consciously or subconsciously. And then as you grew up, your friends and your relationships and those kinds of things began to develop another sense of who God must be to allow these people into your life. And then maybe as you grew a little bigger and began to know how the world worked a little bit more, you understood more about God from the world around us. We tend to have our experience of the presence of God mediated to us through people, not the least of which is Jesus himself, the perfect mediator, because he is both God and human. And so all of our experience of the presence of God is mediated to us by people. And so now we come to the topic we're going to be dealing with today. It's a topic that I call brotherhood. The Bible calls it brotherhood. You can substitute sisterhood in there if you want, but it's this idea that Christians have come together, and in the togetherness, we reveal God better. And what better place to start than two sons of thunder who happen to be brothers and want to call fire down from heaven. So I'm going to give you my first lesson in brotherhood learned from James and John. And here it goes. Brotherhood can sometimes lead us to misunderstand or even abuse the fire of God. I'm giving you this as a warning because sometimes we develop as people to rely on the advice of those who are close to us, more than relying on the advice of those we should rely on. John and James, I don't know who came up with this idea. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, they go to the town gates, and the town says, we don't want Jesus to be in here because we know he's a Jew, and we know he's on his way to Jerusalem, and we're not into that whole supporting Jerusalem thing. And so you guys just move along. Now, I wonder if James and John, which one of them came up with this idea? I mean, maybe James said to John, you know, those Samaritans are kind of sneaky, wrong-headed people. Maybe we should just do something about that. And then the other guy goes, yeah, how about let's tell Jesus to smite them with boils? And the other guy goes, no, it's got to be something better. Let's call fire down from heaven. I wonder who came up with that idea. And then who thought it was a good idea? And then they brought it to Jesus together as a unity. They're like, Jesus, we've got a great idea. Quite often we think of Peter as the one who sticks his foot in his mouth and says all these stupid things. But James and John were just as much there. They even one time got their mom to talk to Jesus and be like, hey, when you come into heaven, can you make James sit on your right and John sit on your left? Or maybe vice versa. But, they recruited their mom. So these guys were not above manipulation. Anyway, I'm just fascinated by this, that this brotherhood mindset of these two guys led them to do something that was just completely outlandish. And so Jesus rebukes them and they move on. Okay. Now that's not really the main reason I went to this passage. In fact, that lesson is just kind of a byproduct. Something that we don't even really need to pay attention, because the big lesson that we're paying attention to today is much deeper, much more significant, and much more life-changing. And I think as you see this lesson, you're going to be amazed at who Jesus is even more. And you should have had a clue, perhaps, by the word Jerusalem. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. Do you know why? Well, so far in this book, he's told us that he's going to die. And Jerusalem is the place where the Romans are. The Romans have set up their leadership in Jerusalem, and they're the ones with the power of crucifixion. And the Jewish religious leaders are all in Jerusalem. And they're the ones with the power to accuse a person of religious problems so that the Romans would crucify them without them being a criminal. And so Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the perfect storm whose end can only be a cross. And did you notice in verse 51, it says, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. If you read the original Greek, what that says is Jesus fixed his face on Jerusalem. It's like a horse who's got the blinders on and can't see left or right. Jesus literally fixed his face on Jerusalem, and he's going to Jerusalem. And now James and John come up to him off the side and they say, Jesus, we got to tell you, we need to call down some fire on this city over here because they won't let you stay there for a while. And Jesus is like, guys, I can't pay attention to all that crud. Whatever it is that you want to do, we're going to Jerusalem. And if we're not going through that city, we're just going to Jerusalem. His face